On a warm summer night in 2019, the kind of night where the air felt heavy with the mix of humidity and youthful recklessness, a farmhouse on the edge of town became the gathering spot for nearly every teenager in the area. It wasn't unusual. This place had hosted gatherings before. The property was tucked back along a dirt road, surrounded by fields that sloped into woods. Parents rarely came by, and that made it the perfect place for kids to escape the watchful eyes of adults. Music pulsed through old speakers on the porch, laughter cut across the fields, and groups splintered into smaller circles, some around a bonfire, others clustered near cars parked haphazardly along the gravel drive. To the kids who came, this was just another night of freedom. But for 17-year-old Ethan Collier, it would be the last night anyone saw him alive. Ethan had come to the party with a couple of friends from his soccer team. He wasn't the loudest in the room, not the one grabbing attention, but people noticed him. He had a way of standing back, leaning against a wall or a tree, and watching the chaos unfold around him. His friends said he hadn't planned on staying long. He had work the next morning, and he had promised his mom he'd be home before it got too late. But once he was there, time slipped. The crowd grew larger, alcohol passed around freely, and arguments sparked between people who hadn't spoken in months. Ethan moved between groups, talking here and there, never seeming drunk but with a kind of restless energy, as though he was keeping one foot out the door. Around midnight, the mood of the party began to shift. Some kids were already passed out inside the farmhouse, others stumbling to their cars despite the pleas of more responsible friends. A couple broke into a screaming match near the bonfire, their voices cutting through the music. And somewhere in the mix of it all, Ethan decided it was time to leave. Witnesses would later say he slung his backpack over his shoulder, pulled his phone from his pocket, and said a quick goodbye before heading toward the road. No one stopped him. After all, kids came and went from these parties all the time. The detail that unsettled investigators later was that no one followed him, and no one saw him again. The farmhouse sat only 2 miles from Ethan's neighborhood. The main road looped around, but there was a shortcut, an old trail through the woods that kids in town had used for years. It wasn't officially marked, but it was known well enough that anyone local could follow it. Ethan had taken it before. To him, it wasn't dangerous. The trail cut past the edge of a ravine and connected to a street just a few blocks from his house. It was a way to shave off time, and walking it alone at night wasn't unusual for a teenager who thought he knew his town inside and out. The problem was that somewhere between the farmhouse and his house, Ethan disappeared. His phone, which had been lit up with messages throughout the night, went silent. The last activity was recorded just minutes after he left, an unread text from a teammate asking if he had made it home. It showed as delivered but never opened. Hours later, his mom, who had fallen asleep waiting for him, woke to find his bed empty. At first, she thought he might have stayed at a friend's house. By sunrise, when none of his friends had heard from him, panic began to spread. The first calls went out that morning. Parents of kids at the party compared stories, piecing together who left when, who drove who home. Ethan's name kept coming up, but no one could account for his movements after the farmhouse. A couple of people swore they saw him walking down the dirt road alone, phone light glowing faintly in his hand, backpack straps pulled tight across his shoulders. Others claimed they thought he mentioned the trail. But there were no solid details, no one who walked with him, no one who could say what happened next. By mid-morning, word had spread beyond the families and into the community. Local police arrived, speaking with the property owner, canvassing the area, and beginning what they called a welfare search. At first, they treated it like a runaway case. Teenagers went missing overnight more often than people wanted to admit, and most turned up within a day. But there were details that didn't fit. His car still parked at home, his wallet and money untouched, his work clothes laid out for the next day. Nothing suggested he had planned to vanish. As the sun rose higher, his family drove the back roads themselves, calling his name, checking ditches, pulling over when they thought they saw something in the grass. The woods along the shortcut became the first place people looked. Parents and neighbors walked the trail, some shouting, others searching quietly, listening for any sound that might explain where he had gone. They found nothing. The trail was as it had always been, quiet, overgrown in places, empty. By noon, the case no longer felt like a misunderstanding. The sheriff called in additional units, volunteers began to gather, and whispers moved through the small town. A 17-year-old boy had left a party, alone, and never made it home. There was no crash site, no note, no reason. Only a gap of minutes between when he was last seen and when he was supposed to walk through his front door. That silence stretched longer as the day went on, and by evening, people began asking the question no one wanted to say out loud. If Ethan hadn't run away, if he hadn't made it home, then where was he? And who might have been with him in those woods that night? The first 24 hours after Ethan vanished were chaos disguised as procedure. At sunrise, deputies retraced the trail behind the farmhouse, marking paths with orange tape, listening for anything that might suggest movement. Within hours, more than 50 volunteers from town had joined them, forming human chains through the woods. Parents shouted his name, classmates combed the underbrush with sticks, and officers followed the ravine's edge where the shortcut dipped dangerously close. For the first time in years, that trail, normally a harmless passage for teenagers, looked sinister. The silence that came back from it only deepened the unease. Canine units were brought in before noon. The dogs caught Ethan's scent from the farmhouse porch, followed it along the dirt road, and then toward the path leading into the trees. For nearly a mile, the dogs pulled their handlers forward with energy, noses down, tails stiff. But then, abruptly, they stopped. The scent dissolved near a bend in the trail where gravel met hard soil. Searchers fanned out from that spot, but the dogs never regained the trail. The abrupt ending fueled every theory. Had Ethan gotten into a car? Had he been lifted off the path? Or was it just that the scent was lost to the wind? Back at his house, his mother and stepfather answered questions through tears. Detectives noted the details: Ethan's wallet still in his desk drawer, his car parked in the driveway, the keys hung neatly on their hook. His work uniform lay folded across the chair in his room, ready for the next morning. There was nothing to suggest preparation for leaving. His mother insisted he had no reason to run away, that he was responsible, dependable. The phone records confirmed what she feared most. The device had gone dark at 12:21 a.m., just minutes after leaving the farmhouse. The last ping was somewhere along the wooded shortcut. After that, nothing. Detectives began knocking on doors, starting with the farmhouse owner, who was rattled but cooperative. The party had gotten out of hand, they admitted, but nothing violent had happened inside the house. Teenagers who were still recovering from the night were asked to recount what they'd seen. The stories were muddy at best. Alcohol blurred memories, and fear twisted the rest. Some said Ethan left alone. Others thought they saw him talking to another boy near the tree line. A girl recalled him looking frustrated, maybe even angry, but couldn't remember with whom. The lack of clarity only made suspicion spread wider. By evening, rumors ran rampant. Some kids claimed Ethan had been in a fight. Others whispered that he had overdosed, that someone at the party had panicked and hidden the truth. Online forums picked up the story almost immediately, framing it as another small-town cover-up. Strangers speculated about everything from cult activity in the woods to drug deals gone wrong. For the investigators trying to separate fact from fiction, the noise became a problem. The more people talked, the harder it was to pin down what had actually happened in the final minutes Ethan was seen. The second day brought more organized searching. Helicopters circled above the woods with thermal cameras, though the dense tree cover limited their reach. Divers probed sections of the ravine, finding nothing but discarded tires and rusting cans. Deputies searched barns and abandoned sheds within a 2-mile radius. Each new lead dissolved into the same emptiness. No shoe prints, no discarded clothing, not even a broken branch that could be tied to Ethan with certainty. It was as if the trail had swallowed him whole. At the farmhouse, detectives re-interviewed the closest circle of friends. It was there the inconsistencies grew sharper. One boy admitted Ethan had argued briefly with someone over a girl earlier in the night, but he downplayed it as nothing serious. Another contradicted him, saying Ethan looked upset enough to leave because of it. When pressed, both clammed up, unwilling or unable to name the person. The evasiveness drew suspicion, but without physical evidence, there was nowhere to push further. Meanwhile, Ethan's family clung to hope. His mother refused to leave the search site, standing at the trailhead until deputies finally convinced her to rest. She kept repeating that he would never leave on his own. Neighbors brought food, but no one could eat. Every hour without news felt heavier. The thought of him lying injured somewhere in those woods gnawed at everyone. By the end of the second day, the sheriff admitted publicly what families already knew in their hearts. This was no longer a simple missing person call. Something had happened in those woods, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding Ethan alive seemed to shrink. The first 48 hours ended not with resolution, but with silence. The search grid was expanded, the partygoers were warned they would be questioned again, and the town braced for the reality no one wanted to face, that whatever had happened to Ethan, it had left no trace on the surface, which meant the truth, if it existed at all, was buried deeper, hidden somewhere only time or a mistake would eventually reveal. Detectives quickly realized that the search alone wouldn't be enough. With no physical evidence to anchor the case, they turned to people, those who might have had reason to hurt Ethan or knew something about the last hours of his night. The first lead came from within the party itself. Several kids admitted that Ethan had been seen talking to a girl he'd once dated on and off. She wasn't with him when he left, but whispers started that her current boyfriend, a volatile kid with a short fuse, had noticed. By Monday morning, the boyfriend's name was at the center of speculation. Detectives brought him in, sat him down, and pressed for answers. His alibi was thin. He claimed he left the party around midnight, drove straight home, and stayed there until morning. His parents backed up his story, saying they heard him come in. Still, deputies checked his car, his clothes, even his phone records. Nothing tied him to Ethan. No blood, no scratches, no messages that suggested jealousy boiling into violence. For the time being, he was cleared. The next lead took investigators beyond the party. A handful of witnesses recalled seeing a drifter around town in the days leading up to Ethan's disappearance. He had been spotted near the highway, walking with a backpack and sleeping under a bridge. Rumors flared instantly. Strangers made easy suspects, and the timing felt too coincidental. Deputies canvassed rest stops, bus stations, and truck stops, eventually locating a man who fit the description in a neighboring county. He had a history of vagrancy, minor theft, and substance abuse. When questioned, he admitted to being near the town but denied any involvement with Ethan. His timeline was muddy, but no evidence tied him to the boy. No one had seen him at the farmhouse, and his belongings turned up nothing. Though suspicion lingered in the minds of locals, detectives quietly moved him off the main suspect list. The third lead was closer to home and far more uncomfortable for the family. Investigators learned that Ethan's older cousin had provided him alcohol at the party. At first glance, it was a minor offense, but as details emerged, it became clear the cousin had been drinking heavily himself and left the party not long after Ethan. Friends said the two had spoken briefly, maybe even argued. The cousin denied any conflict, insisting he left before midnight and never saw Ethan walk off. But phone records told a slightly different story. His phone pinged near the trailhead around the same time Ethan's last signal was recorded. When questioned, he brushed it off as coincidence, claiming he had driven past the area heading home. The inconsistency made investigators lean in harder, but still there was no hard evidence, no confession, no physical trace to hold him on. By the end of the week, all three leads had dissolved into dead ends. Each seemed promising at first, each carried the weight of possibility, and each collapsed under scrutiny. With nothing solid to present, detectives were left circling the same questions they had from the start. How could a 17-year-old vanish in a 2-mile stretch of woods? If it was foul play, where was the scene? If it was an accident, why had no trace been found? The community grew restless. Some residents whispered that law enforcement was protecting someone, that the cousin had connections, that the boyfriend was being shielded. Others leaned toward a darker theory, suggesting Ethan overdosed at the farmhouse, and kids panicked, hiding his body somewhere in the woods before authorities arrived. Anonymous tips poured in, each more speculative than the last. Deputies followed up on everyone, but each call ended the same way, with no evidence, no body, and no closure. For Ethan's family, the rumors cut deepest. His mother refused to believe he had overdosed, pointing to his clean record, his ambitions, his job. His stepfather said the idea of him being hidden by friends was a nightmare made up by people who didn't know him. Yet with no new evidence surfacing, even close friends began second-guessing what they remembered. The image of Ethan leaving alone, backpack slung, phone in hand, started to blur into uncertainty. Some swore he had been angry, others insisted he was calm. A few even questioned if they had seen him leave at all. The investigation slowed under the weight of speculation. Detectives continued interviews, scoured nearby counties, and even consulted outside agencies, but without physical proof, momentum drained. Weeks turned to months, the trail of leads went cold, and the case slipped into a painful limbo. The initial urgency gave way to long silences, broken only by the echo of rumors that seemed to grow louder than the facts. And in the quiet of those months, a new, more haunting question took hold in the community. What if Ethan hadn't left that trail by choice? What if someone had made sure he never walked out of those woods at all? The first year after Ethan's disappearance moved like a blur of false starts and fading headlines. In the weeks that followed the initial search, detectives chased every tip they received, but each one ended the same way. Empty fields, dead phone numbers, vague claims that evaporated under scrutiny. By the time his 18th birthday passed, the search had lost its urgency. Officially, the case was still open, but detectives quietly admitted among themselves that they had no leads left to pursue. To his family, that silence was unbearable. They refused to let his memory fade, organizing a candlelight vigil on the anniversary of his disappearance. Dozens gathered with photos of Ethan taped to poster boards, his name spoken into the night as though saying it aloud might somehow bring him back. Year 2 was harder. The community's initial shock gave way to fatigue, and fewer people turned out for the vigils. His mother still stood with a candle, her voice cracking as she read a letter she had written to her son. His younger sister clutched a photo of him in his soccer uniform, refusing to blow out her candle until the very end. Detectives attended quietly, but offered nothing new. When pressed by reporters, the sheriff could only say the investigation was active, though no new searches were underway. It became clear to everyone that whatever answers existed were buried deeper than anyone had managed to dig. As time stretched on, Ethan's friends began to scatter. Some graduated and left town for college, others moved for work. Life kept moving forward, but guilt lingered like an anchor they couldn't shake. A few admitted privately that they still replayed that night, questioning their own memories, wondering if they had missed something, if a detail they overlooked might have changed everything. One boy confided to his parents that he sometimes heard footsteps when he walked the wooded shortcut, even years later, and it made him feel sick to think Ethan might have been just steps away, unseen. None of them found closure. Instead, they carried fragments of a night that never seemed to end. Online, the case took on a life of its own. True crime forums picked it apart, poring over maps of the trail, dissecting interviews, speculating about suspects. Some threads argued abduction was the only explanation, pointing to the sudden end of the scent trail. Others pushed stranger theories, suggesting secret gatherings in the woods or cult activity that the town had covered up. A handful insisted it was an overdose that had been hidden, pointing at the cousin's involvement with alcohol. With every year that passed, the theories grew wilder, feeding off the vacuum left by the absence of facts. Ethan's name circulated far beyond his hometown, but in the places that mattered most, there were still no answers. By the 3rd anniversary, his mother's voice carried a sharper edge. She no longer pleaded for help, she demanded it. She held up a photo of Ethan at the vigil, her hands trembling, and told the crowd that her son had not simply vanished, that someone knew the truth, and that silence was the same as complicity. For her, hope had shifted into a form of defiance. She was determined to keep his story alive, even as detectives warned her there was little more they could do. That year, the family launched a website dedicated to Ethan's case, gathering tips, posting updates, and refusing to let his memory slip into the quiet files of cold case storage. Still, time wore people down. For neighbors and classmates, the tragedy calcified into the background of their lives. Conversations about Ethan grew shorter, references fading into awkward pauses. Teachers who once spoke his name aloud in classrooms moved on to new students, new years. Yet for his family, every day without him was a wound that never healed. His room remained untouched, his clothes stayed folded in drawers. His mother admitted she sometimes sat at his desk late at night, scrolling through old messages on his phone bill just to feel like she was keeping a connection alive. By the fourth year, the weight of his absence had settled into the town like an unspoken rule. The farmhouse where the party had taken place sat abandoned, its windows boarded, the grass overgrown, as though the night of his disappearance had cursed it. Friends who once laughed about that summer now avoided the subject altogether. The vigils still happened, but attendance dwindled further, reduced mostly to family and a small circle of loyal supporters. Candles flickered against the dark, fewer each year, but still burning. For investigators, the case had become what they feared most, a mystery frozen in place. Without new evidence, there was nothing left to pursue. No warrant to justify, no trail to follow. When pressed, they admitted quietly to reporters off the record that they had no answers left. The file sat thick with interviews and maps, but thin on proof. It wasn't closed, but it wasn't moving. As the fourth anniversary approached, even the most hopeful admitted it had become a tragedy without explanation. Ethan's family refused to stop, but the community spoke of him less often, and the investigation was little more than a collection of unresolved threads. His absence had become part of the town's landscape, like the woods themselves, always there, always present, but silent. It seemed as though Ethan Collier's story had settled permanently into the cold, his fate bound to speculation and rumor. But just as his case appeared destined to remain unsolved, the woods were about to give up something they had held in silence for years. In the summer of 2023, the town was locked in a heat wave that stretched on for weeks. The riverbeds that usually ran thick and fast thinned to trickles, and the wooded ravine 2 miles from the old farmhouse was drier than anyone could remember. Branches that had once been hidden under water now jutted into the air like broken bones, and the earth below them cracked into jagged patterns. Few people ventured out there in those conditions. It was too hot, too silent, but one hiker had taken the trail, curious about what the drought had revealed. He moved slowly along the ravine, stepping carefully across stones when something caught his eye. A splash of faded fabric tangled high in the limbs of a fallen tree. At first, it looked like debris carried by the river during past floods, the kind of thing no one bothered with. But as he drew closer, he realized it was a backpack, sun-bleached, the straps frayed and torn as though it had been there for years. The hiker untangled it carefully, his fingers brushing against stiff fabric that crumbled slightly under his grip. The weight inside surprised him. It wasn't empty. He lowered it to the ground, unzipped the main pocket, and found items that immediately shifted the discovery from curiosity to dread. A cracked phone, the screen spiderwebbed and dark, a lighter still faintly recognizable under the grime, and then, slipped in the inner pouch, a laminated school ID with the name Ethan Collier stamped across the bottom. The photo showed the same boy who had vanished from the farmhouse party 4 years earlier. The hiker froze, the silence of the ravine pressing down heavier than the heat. He knew exactly what he had stumbled on, and it was enough to send him scrambling back to the trailhead, phone in hand to call authorities. By that evening, the ravine was no longer an abandoned stretch of woods. It was lit with the glow of floodlights, police cruisers lining the gravel road above it. Yellow tape marked the perimeter as investigators moved cautiously, documenting the scene with cameras and notes. The backpack, now in evidence bags, was handled with extreme care. Detectives knew that after 4 years of silence, this was the first tangible connection to Ethan since the night he vanished. His family was notified immediately, and when word spread, the town erupted with shock. For some, the discovery confirmed their darkest suspicions. For others, it reignited hope that answers were finally within reach. Forensic teams scoured the ravine, inch by inch. They sifted through the dried mud, checked tree roots, and combed every inch of exposed ground where water had receded. The area where the backpack had been lodged looked as though it had been submerged for years, only now revealed by the drought. Investigators speculated that it might have been swept downstream during storms or floods, carried from its original resting place before getting caught in the branches. That raised an unsettling possibility. If the backpack had moved, what else might still be hidden beneath layers of soil and water nearby? News outlets descended on the town almost instantly. Reporters framed the discovery as the long-awaited break in a case that had haunted the community for nearly half a decade. Images of the backpack and the ID card spread across social media, reigniting online forums that had kept Ethan's story alive. Theories flared anew. Some argued the backpack had been planted to stir up the case again, while others insisted it was proof he had been attacked and discarded in the woods that night. Detectives, however, refused to speculate publicly. They emphasized only that the area was now an active crime scene and every detail mattered. For Ethan's family, the news was devastating and electrifying all at once. His mother clutched the phone as detectives explained what had been found. For her, the ID card was proof he hadn't simply walked away, that something had anchored his fate to those woods. She drove to the ravine, standing behind the yellow tape, staring down at the floodlights as if willing them to reveal more. Neighbors who had once stopped talking about the case now gathered again, whispering at the barricades, exchanging theories like they had in the first weeks after Ethan's disappearance. As investigators carried evidence bags to waiting vehicles, the sheriff addressed the press in clipped tones. The backpack, phone, and lighter would undergo forensic testing. Any DNA, fingerprints, or trace material that survived could be the key to unraveling what had happened that night. Though the objects had been weathered by years of exposure, hope hinged on the idea that technology might uncover what the human eye could not. That night, the ravine felt transformed. What had once been just another stretch of forgotten woods had become a stage where the town's unanswered questions returned in full force. Forensic lights cast eerie shadows across the cracked earth, the silence punctuated by the scrape of tools and the low murmur of investigators marking coordinates. To the community watching from behind the tape, it was the first real movement in years, the first sign that the truth might not be buried forever. By dawn, the hikers' discovery had reignited not just the investigation, but the emotions that had lain dormant in the town. For those who had carried guilt, it resurfaced like a wound reopened. For Ethan's family, it was a cruel reminder of his absence, but also a glimmer of the closure they had begged for. And for detectives who had filed his case into the category of unsolved mysteries, the backpack was now a signal, a message from the woods, that Ethan's story wasn't over yet. Forensic crews spent days in the ravine, moving carefully over ground that had been hidden underwater for years. Every inch was flagged, mapped, and photographed. Soil specialists collected samples from the banks and the lowest points of the dried bed, looking for chemical signatures that might suggest decomposition. Drone mapping created a high-resolution reconstruction of the ravine, and from above, something unexpected appeared, a patch of ground near the tree line that seemed darker, compacted differently from its surroundings. To investigators, it looked less like erosion and more like a place where someone had camped or concealed something. Cadaver dogs were deployed along that stretch, their handlers leading them in wide sweeps. The dogs moved eagerly, noses down, tails stiff, until more than once they alerted near the same patch of soil. Crews began digging carefully, layer by layer, but what they unearthed was not what anyone had braced for. Shards of bone began to surface, brittle and pale. For a moment, tension rippled through the search as everyone held their breath, waiting to hear confirmation. But the lab results came back within hours. The fragments were animal remains, likely deer or coyote, not human. Relief and disappointment struck simultaneously. For Ethan's family, the possibility of closure had dangled in front of them, only to be pulled away again. For detectives, the alerts still mattered. Something about that ground had triggered the dogs, and that meant the search wasn't over. Meanwhile, the evidence from the backpack had been rushed to the state crime lab. Ethan's cracked phone was examined by digital forensic specialists who carefully bypassed its corroded circuits and battered screen. To everyone's surprise, the device still held fragments of data. Among them were photos taken the night he vanished. Most were blurry shots of trees, branches glowing in the light of his phone, the ground visible in streaks of dirt and leaves. They painted the picture of someone walking the wooded trail, documenting as he moved. But then came a photo that stopped investigators cold. In the distance, barely illuminated, was the faint outline of a human figure. The image was distorted, motion blurred, but the shape was unmistakable. Ethan had not been alone in those woods. The discovery reframed everything. For years, the assumption had been that Ethan left the party by himself, a teenager, cutting across a familiar path in the dark. Now, there was evidence to suggest he encountered someone, maybe followed, maybe confronted. Detectives enlarged the image, ran it through enhancement software, but the result was the same, a silhouette too vague to identify, yet clear enough to rule out imagination. Whoever it was had been with him just minutes before his phone went dark. That single image reignited tensions in the town. Online forums lit up with speculation, demanding to know who the figure could be. Some argued it was one of his friends, someone from the party who had lied all these years. Others insisted it was an outsider, maybe the drifter locals had once whispered about. Theories spiraled, but investigators focused on the technical details. Metadata on the phone confirmed the photo was taken at 12:19 a.m., just 2 minutes before his phone shut off forever. Back in the ravine, forensic teams expanded the grid, convinced that the ground still held more to give. They sifted through soil, bagged every fragment, logged every anomaly. Even the smallest items, rusted bottle caps, scraps of fabric, were collected. Specialists noted that the terrain bore marks of repeated human presence, flattened grass in patterns inconsistent with animal bedding, ash buried shallow in the soil, suggesting an old fire. To them, it looked as though the ravine had once hosted a makeshift campsite, perhaps even on the very night Ethan disappeared. Detectives returned to the farmhouse trailhead, retracing his likely steps with fresh eyes. If Ethan had walked that path intending to go home, what reason would he have to stop in the ravine? Who could have been waiting there, and how had a backpack containing his phone, lighter, and ID ended up lodged in the branches years later, as though discarded or swept downstream? The questions piled higher than the answers, but for the first time in 4 years, investigators had tangible evidence. The photo, blurred as it was, became the centerpiece of their investigation. Detectives began showing it quietly to witnesses, watching reactions closely. Some swore it looked like no one they knew, while others hesitated, unsure. The ambiguity only deepened the mystery, but the mere fact of the photo shattered the long-held narrative. Ethan had not vanished into silence. He had crossed paths with someone, and whatever happened after that was no accident of the woods. The ravine was no longer just terrain to be searched. It was the last place Ethan had been alive. And the blurred figure in the photo meant his story was entwined with someone else's secrets. Detectives returned to the people who had been at the farmhouse that night, determined to test old stories against the new evidence. 4 years had passed, and the group of friends who once huddled together in fear had scattered. Some were in college, others working jobs in different towns. Many had hoped they would never have to relive that night. But the photo from Ethan's phone changed everything. Investigators reached out one by one, sitting them down in quiet rooms, replaying their memories with sharper questions than before. This time, the cracks showed. 2 friends who had previously claimed Ethan was calm when he left admitted under pressure that he'd been talking about confronting someone at the party. They said he used the words, "owe me an apology," but neither could remember exactly who he meant. One swore it was about an argument earlier in the evening, possibly over a girl. The other insisted it was something more personal, a grudge that had been simmering long before that night. Both downplayed the detail when asked why they hadn't mentioned it before. Their excuse was simple. They were scared. They didn't want to get dragged in, and at the time, it hadn't seemed important. But now, paired with the blurred figure in the phone photo, it suddenly mattered a great deal. Another friend, pressed again about the final minutes before Ethan left, hesitated before admitting something she had never said in her original statement. She remembered Ethan walking off not entirely alone. In her memory, someone had been just a few steps behind him, close enough to look like they were leaving together. When detectives confronted her about why she had never said it before, she faltered. She claimed she wasn't sure, that in the chaos of the party her memory had blurred. But the detail had weight because it lined up too neatly with what the phone photo suggested. Ethan hadn't been alone on that trail. The name that surfaced again and again in whispered tones was Mark Fielder. At 19, he had been one of the older kids at the party. Mark had a reputation around town, reckless, short-tempered, always finding trouble. He'd already had brushes with the law, nothing major but enough to make his name linger in the sheriff's office. Some remembered he'd been drinking heavily that night. Others remembered he'd gotten into a heated exchange with Ethan earlier, though no one had been able to prove it. What stood out most now was what happened after. Within weeks of Ethan's disappearance, Mark packed up and left town. He told some people he was going to work with relatives out of state, but to investigators, the timing had always felt too convenient. With no evidence at the time, they had let it slide. Re-examining the timeline, detectives saw gaps that made sense only if Mark had been more involved than he admitted. His departure, his silence over the years, and the way his name kept surfacing in connection to Ethan's confrontation created a pattern too sharp to ignore. Detectives requested new interviews with anyone who had been close to Mark back then, probing for details. A few recalled him acting strange after the disappearance, more withdrawn, more defensive when the case came up. One old friend even admitted Mark had once snapped at him, saying, "Don't bring that night up again," with a force that shut the conversation down. The new focus on Mark reignited old tensions in town. Some residents nodded knowingly, saying they had suspected him all along. Others defended him, arguing it was unfair to dredge up his name without proof. But detectives weren't after rumors. They wanted something concrete. They cross-referenced the phone metadata with the party timeline, searching for gaps that could point to Mark. The blurred figure in Ethan's final photo was circulated quietly among a select group of witnesses. A few said the posture, the build, reminded them of Mark. None could say it definitively, but for detectives it was enough to tighten the circle. Ethan's family followed these developments with a mix of dread and anticipation. For years, they had lived with theories that shifted like sand. Now, for the first time, the pieces seemed to point in one direction. The thought that someone they had once welcomed into their home could have been involved in Ethan's last moments was almost too much to bear. But they also knew the investigation couldn't stall again. They needed the truth, no matter how devastating. Detectives put Mark's name back on the board, not as a footnote this time, but as a renewed focus. They noted the inconsistencies in witness statements, the resurfaced detail of Ethan planning a confrontation, the vague memory of him leaving with someone, and Mark's abrupt exit from town. Combined with the figure in the photo, the picture was beginning to take shape. If Ethan had walked into those woods demanding an apology, there was a real possibility Mark Fielder had been the one to meet him there. And if that was true, then the answers to 4 years of silence lay not in rumor or speculation, but in the life Mark had built since leaving, and the secrets he had carried with him ever since. Detectives finally tracked Mark Fielder down in the late summer of 2023. He was living nearly 2 states away in a small rental house outside a factory town, working irregular shifts and keeping a low profile. The years had changed him. Older, heavier, his once cocky posture dulled by exhaustion. But when investigators knocked on his door, the guarded look in his eyes was unmistakable. He seemed to know why they had come before they said a word. At first, Mark was defensive but cooperative. He admitted being at the farmhouse party, admitted drinking too much, and even conceded that he had walked with Ethan part of the way when he left. But he insisted the story ended there. According to him, they split paths near the ravine, Ethan continuing along the shortcut trail while Mark turned back toward the road. He claimed he hadn't seen Ethan again after that moment. It was a simple explanation designed to close off further questions. But detectives had come armed with more than curiosity. They had records, photos, and evidence that told a different story. They began by pressing him on the phone data. Ethan's last phone ping had come from the ravine at 12:21 a.m., the same window when Mark claimed they parted ways. But cell tower analysis revealed that Mark's phone had also pinged in the same area that night, not just once, but repeatedly. The records placed him in the woods until nearly 3 a.m., more than 2 hours later than he admitted. When confronted, Mark grew tense, his answers less steady. He claimed he had dropped his phone and circled back later to look for it, but the story sounded rehearsed, shaky under pressure. Detectives then turned to the evidence recovered from Ethan's backpack. Forensic analysts had worked painstakingly on the weathered fabric, testing even the seams for trace material. Against the odds, a partial DNA profile was lifted from the inner lining. When compared against the swab taken from Mark, it showed a match, not complete, but strong enough to put him inside the circle of suspicion. Presented with this, Mark bristled, arguing that he might have touched Ethan's belongings at the party. That DNA transfer was possible in crowded environments. But investigators countered with the detail that the sample came from deep within the backpack, in places unlikely to be contaminated by casual contact. As the pressure mounted, Mark's demeanor shifted. He leaned back, folded his arms, and gave clipped, rehearsed responses. He wasn't confessing, but he wasn't outraged at the accusations either. To detectives, his silence between answers said more than his words. They noted how carefully he avoided eye contact when Ethan's name was spoken, how he clenched his jaw when asked why he left town so quickly after the disappearance. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were briefed. A partial DNA match wasn't enough to guarantee conviction, but combined with the phone records and Mark's own admission of walking with Ethan, the case was tightening. Detectives began re-examining every detail of his life since 2019. They interviewed his co-workers, checked his financial history, and pulled his travel records. Nothing suggested he had rebuilt a stable life. He drifted from job to job, never settling, always staying just far enough from the town where Ethan had vanished. To investigators, it looked less like a man moving forward and more like someone trying to stay hidden. Back home, word spread fast. The town buzzed with updates that Mark had been located, that his name was once again tied to Ethan's final night. Some residents felt vindicated. They had always suspected him. Others worried the evidence wasn't strong enough, that the case might collapse again under technicalities. Ethan's family watched the developments with guarded hearts. For them, it was agonizing to see the pieces finally aligning toward someone they had once trusted, someone who had been welcomed into their lives. His mother admitted privately that she had always suspected Mark, but had forced herself to bury the thought, unwilling to believe family could be capable of betrayal. Detectives scheduled a second interview, this time with the evidence laid out more directly. They showed him the blurred figure from Ethan's phone photo, asking if it could be him. Mark denied it, but his denial came too quickly, almost rehearsed. When pressed on the phone records again, he shifted explanations, claiming he lingered in the woods after Ethan left, thinking about things, unable to clarify what that meant. The contradictions mounted, but still no outright confession came. For investigators, it was enough to keep the noose tightening. They had placed him with Ethan, proved his phone lingered where Ethan vanished, and now had a partial DNA match on the one item linking directly to the night of his disappearance. The case was no longer built on speculation or rumor. It was narrowing around Mark Fielder with every passing day. The silence that had suffocated the investigation for 4 years was breaking, replaced by the steady drumbeat of evidence pointing to a single truth. Ethan hadn't walked into those woods alone, and the man who had been with him was finally within reach of the law. Detectives knew they couldn't press Mark forever with circumstantial evidence. They needed to push him to the edge, to force him into the space where silence cracked and the truth began to spill in fragments. The second interview began like the first, with Mark stone-faced, arms crossed, insisting he had nothing to do with Ethan's disappearance. But this time, detectives came prepared with more than phone records and DNA traces. They had the one piece of evidence that could pierce through denial, the blurred image from Ethan's phone, taken just minutes before it went dark. When the photo slid across the table, Mark leaned back as if the air had been punched from him. The grainy shape of a figure caught mid-step was undeniable. It wasn't clear enough for strangers to identify him outright, but to anyone who knew his build, his posture, it was obvious. "That's you," the lead detective said firmly. "That's you in the woods with Ethan." Mark's initial reaction wasn't outrage or shock. It was silence. He rubbed his jaw, his eyes locked on the photo without speaking. When he finally muttered a response, it was the same denial, but weaker than before. Detectives pressed harder, pointing out the contradictions. His story about splitting off early didn't hold when his phone was still pinging near the ravine hours later. The DNA match in Ethan's backpack could not be explained by casual contact at the farmhouse. And now, Ethan's own phone had captured his presence. Piece by piece, the story Mark had clung to for 4 years unraveled. His voice, once steady, grew halting. He admitted walking with Ethan down the trail that night. He admitted they had been arguing. About what he wouldn't specify at first. But with every question, his defenses broke down further. Finally, in fragments, the confession began to emerge. Mark said Ethan had confronted him near the ravine. The words, "Owe me an apology," came back, sharp and heavy. He wouldn't elaborate on the history between them, only that tempers flared. Ethan had shoved him, he claimed, and he shoved back. The ground near the ravine was loose, uneven, and in the darkness neither of them had been steady. In Mark's version, the shoving escalated until Ethan stumbled backward. He described a moment of panic as Ethan slipped from the ledge, disappearing into the brush below. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he repeated. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Detectives listened carefully, noting the way Mark's voice cracked when describing Ethan falling, but steadied again when he spoke about himself. They asked what he did afterward. His story was chilling in its selfishness. He climbed down, tried to reach Ethan, but saw no movement. In the dark, convinced Ethan was gone, he panicked. Instead of calling for help, instead of alerting anyone, he thought only of himself. He admitted grabbing Ethan's backpack, pulling it away from the body, and discarding it further downstream. He hoped that without it, no one would connect him to the scene. Then he left, abandoning Ethan in the ravine and walking back to the road. Mark swore again and again that Ethan's death was accidental, that he never intended harm. But detectives weren't blind to the gaps. If it was panic, why did he hide the backpack? Why leave his phone pinging in the woods for hours after? Why run from the town entirely within weeks? His answers were scattered: fear of being blamed, fear of prison, fear of destroying his future. Each justification only underscored the selfishness of his choices. For Ethan's family, who were briefed afterward, the so-called confession was unbearable. To hear that their son might have survived those first minutes, that help could have reached him if Mark had chosen differently, was a wound deeper than silence. Detectives emphasized that Mark's story might not account for everything. Forensics would still need to confirm whether Ethan's injuries matched the account of a fall, whether defensive wounds on the remains suggested more than shoving. The confession was a piece of the truth, but it was still riddled with self-preservation. Yet for investigators, the breakthrough mattered. After 4 years of denials, they had placed Mark with Ethan in the woods, confirmed his presence through phone records and DNA, and now pulled from him the admission that a confrontation had taken place. His insistence that it was an accident did not erase the fact that Ethan was left alone, discarded, and unreported. The blurred photo from Ethan's phone had spoken louder than Mark's silence ever could. When the interview ended, Mark slumped in his chair, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly against the table. He had not said the words, "I killed him," but in his fragmented admissions, detectives believed they had finally heard the closest thing to the truth that had been buried for 4 years. The tragedy of Ethan's disappearance was no longer framed in rumor or theory. It was framed in a single moment of anger, a shove near a ravine, and a panicked choice that condemned a boy to vanish in silence. But even then, one final step remained. Investigators needed to return to the ravine to uncover what Mark had left behind and to confirm whether his story aligned with the remains that still lay hidden in the soil.